You people think an old ramp is more dangerous than a loaded gun? That's what I told her, right there on the front steps of my father's house, as she held that smug little clipboard and tried to tell me we were in violation for having a safety ramp for a man who can't even walk. What I didn't expect was for this to be the beginning of something much darker. A battle for dignity, safety, and legacy. My name is Marcus Wynn. I'm a structural engineer by trade and a full-time guardian by blood. If you've ever had to stand between someone you love and a bully with a title, then you already know where this is going. Before we dive in, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. And hey, if stories about real justice and smart revenge get your blood pumping, subscribe for more. This isn't just about a ramp, it's about what that ramp represented. My father, Leonard Wynn, is a decorated Korean War veteran. He's been in that chair since the stroke 10 years ago. But he never lost his spirit. He still salutes the flag every morning, still keeps a handwritten map of his old patrol route taped to the wall in his garage. That map was the last thing my little brother touched before he passed. It's more than ink and paper, it's the heart of our home. That house isn't just a place, it's the only thing left that holds our family together. My mom died in the upstairs bedroom. My brother's dog tags are nailed into the back of the old bench by the garden. And the ramp? I built it with my own hands 2 years ago, after Dad nearly fell trying to use a makeshift plywood board. It was my way of telling him he wasn't going anywhere, not while I was here. Enter Judith Langford, HOA president of Ashgrove Ridge. She showed up like she owned the place, designer sunglasses, perfect nails, toned like she was doing us a favor just by speaking to us. Mr. Wynn, I'm afraid this ramp isn't compliant with visual uniformity standards. I stared at her like she'd just spoken Martian. It's for my father, he's disabled, it's a safety issue. Yes, well, we sympathize, she said, not even glancing at him sitting quietly behind the screen door. But community harmony depends on consistent aesthetics. Consistent aesthetics? We're talking about a 6-foot aluminum ramp with rubber grips, not a circus tent. But she handed me the letter anyway. Bold red header, first notice of violation. Reason, unapproved structural modification. Correction, deadline, 14 days. Penalty, $250, 0 cents fine, and daily accrual thereafter. That's how it started. The thing is, Ashgrove Ridge isn't Beverly Hills. It's a quiet suburb built in the 60s with working-class homes, a retired teacher on one side of us, and a half-blind Vietnam vet on the other. My father's house sits at the end of a cul-de-sac lined with oaks, one of which has my brother's initials carved into it, and yet somehow, Judith Langford's mission in life was to make that corner of the world just uniform enough for her taste. My father didn't say much after she left, just stared down at the letter like it was a notice of eviction. You think she means it? He asked me. Doesn't matter, I said. She'll regret delivering it. I don't get riled up easily. I prefer facts, timelines, building codes. But I also know when someone crosses a line, and what this woman didn't know, what none of them knew, was that everything in that house, every object in that yard, every drawing tacked to that garage wall meant something. You mess with that, and you're not just issuing a fine, you're declaring war. I filed the standard appeal with the board, citing ADA compliance and submitting photos of the ramp's specifications. I even included references to federal guidelines on accessibility modifications. 2 days later, they emailed back. Request denied, ramp must be removed. No explanation, no compromise, no discussion. That night, I found my father sitting alone in the garage, staring at the old map. Your mother would have laughed at this, he said. But you know what? She'd have sharpened her tongue and written a letter. Well, I told him, I'm not much of a letter writer, but I've got other tools. And that's when I decided, if they wanted to play this game, I'd make sure they regretted picking this fight. Because this wasn't just about a ramp. It was about how far people will go to bully someone who can't fight back, and how far I'd go to make sure they never try it again. The letter wasn't even cold when the second hit came. 3 days after they denied our appeal, I got another notice, this time for overgrown vegetation in the backyard. It was February. The lawn hadn't even started growing yet. But that didn't stop them from slapping a $100 0-cent citation on the mailbox, folded neatly and taped like a warning. I pulled it off with 2 fingers and walked back inside, teeth clenched. Dad was in the kitchen pouring 2 cups of instant coffee like nothing had changed. I didn't say a word, just slid the notice onto the counter. He glanced at it, then at me, then took a sip. "I miss when mail just meant bills," he said. That was Dad. Quiet humor, dry as gravel. He never reacted the way I did. Never raised his voice, never asked for pity. But he looked smaller somehow, like the years had suddenly remembered where he lived. I started documenting everything. I pulled out my phone and filmed the yard. Barely a leaf out of place. I shot the ramp from every angle. I even printed out a copy of the Americans with Disabilities Act and highlighted relevant sections in yellow. They didn't care. Next came the accusation that our front bench was obstructing the view of the street. That bench had been there since I was 12. It's where my brother gave me his spare keys before he left for deployment. It's where Dad sat every Memorial Day, reading names from a folded list. When the 3rd violation letter came, the tone had shifted. It read more like a threat. The final line stuck with me. "Non-compliance will result in further corrective actions, deemed necessary by the association." I read that one out loud to Dad, who didn't even flinch. "You're poking the wrong bear," I muttered. Dad just nodded. "Let 'em poke. Bears don't bark." The next day, I tried talking to one of the board members, Rob Mendez, the HOA's designated enforcer. He looked like the kind of guy who'd spent more time polishing his belt buckle than reading the bylaws. I caught him outside the community clubhouse. "Rob," I said calmly, "we've lived here 30 years. Doesn't that count for something?" He didn't even pretend to sympathize, just cracked his neck and said, "Rules are rules. If we let one person slide, it all falls apart." "Really? A bench and a ramp? That's what'll bring this neighborhood down?" He leaned in a little, voice low. "You're not special, Marcus. Your old man's not above the code." I was inches from saying something I'd regret, but I didn't. I just nodded and walked away. That was when I decided I'd start keeping a record. Not just the violations, but the tone, the timing, the inconsistencies. If they wanted this to be a paper war, fine. I'd bury them in their own words. That weekend, I drove Dad to the VA hospital for his checkup. On the way back, we passed a for sale sign 2 blocks down. Another veteran's house, empty now. I pulled over, got out, and walked the perimeter. The yard was in worse shape than ours. Broken railing, faded paint, no violation signs anywhere. Double standard? No, it was targeted. I was sure of it. Back at the house, I checked the HOA's website, took screenshots of board meeting minutes, noticed something interesting. Judith Langford had recently signed a contract for community beautification consultation through a shell company, Langford Residential Concepts, LLC. It clicked. This wasn't about rules. It was about flipping properties under pressure. I showed Dad. He squinted at the screen. "She's a snake in pearls." He paused, then pointed at the side panel of the browser. There it was again. The HOA's mission statement. Committed to maintaining the integrity and value of the Ash Grove Ridge community. I laughed. Value for who? I made 3 copies of every document I'd pulled. One for myself, one for the folder I was building, and one I mailed to a friend I hadn't talked to in years. Detective Miles now with the FBI. I didn't tell Dad yet. I needed more. But I had the feeling we were standing in the eye of a storm that hadn't even touched down. That night, I stepped out onto the porch alone. I sat on the old bench, running my hand over the rough initials my brother had carved. The porch light buzzed above me. For a moment, I just stared at the quiet street, and I realized something. This wasn't just about fighting. It was about remembering what's worth fighting for. The next morning, I found Dad sitting on the porch in his coat, even though the sun hadn't broken through the clouds yet. "Didn't sleep?" I asked. He just tapped the wheels of his chair. Didn't feel like dreaming. I was halfway through replying when a white HOA-marked SUV turned the corner, slow and deliberate. It crept down the street like it was hunting something out of place. I stepped out, arms crossed, and watched it roll past. Inside sat Rob Mendez, sunglasses on, window cracked. He didn't wave, just nodded once, then parked across from our house. No clipboard this time. Dad said nothing, but I saw his fingers curl just slightly on the armrest. "I'm calling Miles," I muttered. "I don't want the feds here just yet," Dad replied. Let's not give them an excuse to act like we're the crazy ones. But that wasn't the day to stay quiet. At 3:14 p.m., I left for the hardware store. Just 20 minutes. I was fixing the garden light that had snapped in last week's storm. I even brought receipts in case Judith tried to fine us for exposed wires. When I pulled back into the driveway, something felt off. The front door was open, but not wide, just a few inches. "Dad?" I called out as I stepped inside. No answer. That's when I heard it. "You've got 72 hours to comply, or the board will take formal corrective action. I don't care how long you've lived here." I turned the corner into the living room, and there he was, Rob, standing inside the house, boots on the carpet, right hand resting on the handle of a holstered firearm. And across from him, my father in his wheelchair, not blinking. My voice shot across the room like a whip. "Get out of my house. Now." Rob didn't flinch. "HOA enforcement. I gave notice to enter for inspection." He opened the door. "No, he didn't. I've got cameras. You open that door." He finally stepped back toward the threshold but didn't leave. "You threatening a man in a wheelchair with a sidearm now?" I said, louder. "That part of the bylaws too?" "Back off," Rob warned. "This is protocol." I stepped right up to him, heart pounding. "You've got exactly 3 seconds to get off this property, or I'll make a call that ends your career in law enforcement, if you ever had one." I watched something flicker behind his shades. Hesitation or calculation, I wasn't sure, but he backed out and down the steps, walking without a word to his SUV. The door slammed, engine roared, and the car peeled off. I turned back. Dad's hands were on his knees, gripping tightly like he was holding something in. "You okay?" I asked. He nodded. "I'm just tired of being quiet." He wasn't the only one. 10 minutes later, I was on the phone with Detective Miles. "Gun drawn," he said. "On private property? During an HOA inspection? That's not just overreach, Marcus, that's a federal violation. You think they'll go after him? See my will if I file it right. But I'll need testimony, security footage, affidavits, the whole thing airtight. You up for it?" "I've been up for it." What I didn't notice until later was that we had a witness. Across the street, from behind his garden hedge, Eric Dalton, the HOA treasurer, had been watching. I caught his eyes for a second. He ducked inside his house quickly, like a kid who'd just seen something he couldn't unsee. That evening, he left a sticky note on my windshield. No name, no handwriting I recognized, just 5 words. I didn't agree to this. It didn't say much, but it said enough. Inside, I found Dad polishing the bench outside, the one with my brother's initials. "You know what I remember?" he said. "After the war, people respected each other's space. You didn't need a title to do the right thing." "They're hiding behind titles," I said, "but that shield's cracking." He tapped the bench once with his cloth. "Then break it." I filed the police report that same night. I even brought a flash drive with the porch camera footage, Rob stepping over the threshold, hand near his weapon, my father visibly backing his chair away. The officer behind the counter at the local precinct barely looked up. Is he a licensed security officer or law enforcement? "He's a guy with an HOA badge and a complex," I snapped. The officer blinked slowly, unimpressed. "If there's no physical harm or discharge of the weapon, it's a civil matter. HOAs are considered private entities. Try small claims court." Small claims court? For pointing a gun at a disabled vet? My chest burned as I walked out, but I didn't argue. I knew better than to waste energy convincing someone who'd already decided not to listen. Dad didn't even ask when I came back empty-handed, just nodded once and went back to dusting the folded flag on the mantel. Later that evening, I called our city council rep's office, left a detailed message with timestamps, names, and a list of all the HOA violations filed against us in the past month. The assistant called me back 2 days later, all apologies and canned sympathy. "We don't regulate HOAs directly, Mr. Wynn. They're autonomous under state housing statutes." Autonomous. That word kept echoing, like they were a rogue state operating under their own constitution. The idea that people could hide behind bureaucracy while threatening families made my stomach twist. So I went somewhere no HOA ever expects you to go, the neighbors. I started with Elena. She lived 3 doors down and used to be a journalist before retiring. I figured if anyone would smell a cover-up, it'd be her. I heard about Rob, she said, standing at her screen door with her hair tied in a loose scarf. Word's gotten around, you know, but nobody wants to get involved. I asked her if she'd seen the board act like this before. Oh, sweetheart, she sighed, you're not the first. They went after the Rowans after Harry got Parkinson's, said their driveway was too steep to be up to code, fined them till they moved. Then they beautified the lot and doubled the value. Judith bought that house, I said, flipped it under her LLC. Elena's eyes narrowed. Of course she did. She invited me in, pulled out a file of old newspaper clippings and board newsletters she'd saved. I keep things, she said, shrugging. Habit of an old reporter. You never know when someone's going to rewrite the truth. There was a photo, Judith smiling next to a community revitalization sign, Rob standing behind her, arms crossed. The caption was dated 5 years ago, a year before the Rowans left. This is a pattern, I said. She nodded. But proving it, that's the trick. When I stepped back outside, the sun was setting behind the tree with my brother's initials carved into it. The shadows stretched long across the lawn, but it didn't feel like nightfall, it felt like warning. The next morning, I found another find in the mailbox. This one claimed the American flag on our porch was too large for the bracket and posed a potential safety risk in high winds. I laughed, actually laughed, because at that point they weren't even trying to hide it anymore. I didn't tear the notice up, I added it to the folder. That night, Dad wheeled out onto the porch while I was patching the garden light. He was holding something folded in his lap. Remember this? He asked, unfolding an old legal envelope. Inside was a letter from Vet's first legal aid, dated nearly a decade ago. He had contacted them once when our county denied him a property tax exemption due to a clerical error. I kept it, he said. Didn't want to be the guy always needing help, but I think maybe now's the time. It was more than a letter. It was a foothold, a reason to believe we weren't entirely alone. I scanned the number and called that night. Left a message, clear and calm, explained everything. By the time I finished, my voice wasn't shaking, but my hand was clenched tight around the receiver. You're not quitting, are you? Dad asked from the hallway. Not even close. You'll win. You're smarter than they are. Not just smarter, I said, louder. After the call with Vet's first legal aid, I knew we needed more than just legal advice. We needed undeniable proof, buried beneath years of silence. So I returned to the basement where the house seemed to hold its own secrets, waiting patiently to be uncovered. The basement was cold and cluttered, the air thick with dust and forgotten memories. The single bare bulb overhead flickered sporadically, casting long shadows that danced across the cracked concrete floor. The creaking pipes overhead groaned softly, like the house itself was waking up after a long sleep. I pulled aside a sagging sheet of plastic that covered a pile of old boxes stacked against the far wall. As I lifted the top box, I noticed the floorboards beneath it creaked louder than the rest. Curious, I knelt and pried at the edges until a small panel popped loose, revealing a hidden compartment just large enough for a few folders. My heart raced as I pulled out a dusty metal box, its surface mottled with rust. The latch protested loudly as I forced it open, releasing a musty scent that smelled like forgotten years. Inside were stacks of faded documents, brittle letters and faded photographs, all meticulously organized. The first folder bore my mother's handwriting, HOA correspondence. Leafing through, I found letters from the HOA, some unsigned, others bearing Judith Langford's unmistakable signature. They outlined fines, complaints, and threats, not just against my family, but others in the neighborhood. One note caught my eye, handwritten in hurried script on a torn piece of notepad paper. It read, "Do not trust Judith. She hides more than rules." No signature, but the urgency was clear. Deeper in the box were invoices from Langford Holdings LLC, a shell company tied to the HOA president, for landscaping and community enhancement projects that seemed suspiciously timed to follow forced home sales. As I took photos and scanned the documents, a faint sound startled me, a soft shuffling from upstairs. My hands shook slightly, but I told myself this was just the house settling. I tucked the documents safely away and made my way upstairs, the old wooden stairs creaking beneath my weight. Dad was in his favorite chair by the window, reading the same old map of his patrol routes, oblivious to the discoveries below. That night, I spread the papers across the kitchen table. The pattern was undeniable, a coordinated campaign to target vulnerable homeowners and push them out for profit. This wasn't just petty fines, it was a calculated war against families like mine. The next day, I started visiting neighbors, armed with copies of the documents. Most were hesitant, afraid to speak openly, but a few confided heartbreaking stories of harassment and forced sales. Their eyes told me this was bigger than I had imagined. I ended one visit under the fading light by the old oak tree, its sprawling branches sheltering the neighborhood like a silent guardian. I traced the carved initials of my brother into the bark and promised myself I'd protect what was left. Returning home, I showed Dad the letters and photos. His gaze was steady but filled with quiet sorrow. "They tried to break more than just rules," he said softly. "They tried to break us." I nodded, feeling the weight of the fight ahead. But now, armed with the truth, I was ready to strike back. The documents on the desk were still dusty when I came back upstairs. I hadn't even closed the false panel behind the shelves in the basement yet. My hands were still smudged with grime, but the papers? Pristine, preserved, labeled in my mother's handwriting. Neat, looping cursive like she was leaving a message for someone she knew would eventually need it. Inside one folder was a name I hadn't thought of in years. Melinda Caro. She'd lived on the north end of Ashgrove Ridge, 5 houses past the tennis courts. Widowed, her son had autism. I remembered seeing him riding his scooter in the mornings, wearing headphones and a superhero cape. They were gone now, I just never knew why. The file had everything, dated fines, letters, HOA meeting notes, dozens of violations stacked up over a single year, most of them ridiculous. Unpainted mailbox, unapproved garden gnome, wind chimes. One letter, dated 6 years ago, actually accused her of creating an audio nuisance through repetitive clinking. I sat back in the old wooden chair and stared at the page. It didn't take much to put it together. She'd been pushed out, just like the Rowans, just like they were trying to do to my father. And in each file my mom had collected, one name kept showing up at the bottom of the notices: Judith Langford, her signature over and over again. Her HOA presidency wasn't a public service, it was a strategy. I took photos of everything, labeled and cataloged. Then I opened the envelope from Vet's first legal aid that Dad had saved. I scanned the letter, checking the contact line. I dialed the number. "Veteran Legal Services, how can we help?" I gave them everything. Who I was, who my father was, what happened with the ramp, the threats, the armed incident, and now the documentation we had just uncovered. There was a pause, then a slow, measured voice. "You've got a case," the intake officer said. "Actually, you've got about 3. By the end of the call, we had an appointment set for the following Thursday. But I wasn't going to wait until then to act. I needed more. Not just documents, but people. So I started walking. Not many folks in Ashgrove Ridge liked to answer the door when they saw me. Word had gotten around. HOA trouble tends to make everyone skittish, but I got lucky on the 3rd knock. An elderly man named Mr. Delaney, Vietnam vet, cane in one hand and remote in the other. "Your dad still have that bench out front?" he asked. "I hope." "And he's still fighting. What do you need?" I explained what had happened, and something in his face softened. Not pity, not anger, just quiet recognition. He waved me in, pointed to a box beneath the side table. Every letter they sent me in 2020, fined me for the placement of my oxygen tank near the porch, said it was a tripping hazard, it was chained to the rail. He let me take copies, even gave me an old neighborhood directory that listed HOA board members over the years. Judith had held multiple positions before becoming president, and with each title, another family quietly vanished from the directory. This wasn't disorganization, it was engineering. Slow, intentional, hidden beneath policy and vague language. That night, I brought the folder to Dad. We sat on the porch under the weak glow of the repaired garden light. "You remember Melinda?" I asked. Dad nodded. "She cried the night they loaded the truck, said it didn't feel like home anymore." It wasn't. He looked down at the file, then at the tree in the yard, the one with my brother's initials still carved into the bark. "You said I was smarter than them," I said. "I'm going to prove it." Dad didn't answer with words. He just reached out, set his hand gently on mine, and squeezed once, like he was giving me the last bit of something he'd been holding in reserve. The next day, I printed everything. Case files, neighborhood maps, names, board rosters, dates. I stacked them by category, highlighted signatures. I didn't need a miracle. I needed a strategy. And this time, I wasn't just reacting. I was preparing to hit back. It was just past dusk when the knock came. Soft, hesitant, almost apologetic. I opened the door to find Eric Dalton standing there, clutching something small in his hand. His face was pale and his eyes darted around like he was looking for an escape route. "I didn't know it would go this far," he whispered, before I could say anything. Eric wasn't the kind of guy who raised his voice at meetings. He always sat at the corner table, eyes down, balancing numbers. But now, he looked like a man carrying a secret too heavy for his shoulders. He slipped a small USB drive into my palm. "I can't be part of this anymore. Judith, she's pushing it too far. We're not just enforcing rules, we're breaking families." I glanced at the device. It was unmarked, the kind of thing you'd expect to be forgotten in a drawer. But I knew better. "Well now?" I asked quietly. He swallowed hard. "I've been here since day one, watching them chip away at the community, one victim at a time. I thought it was just paperwork, fines. But after the gun incident, I couldn't stand it." I motioned for him to come in. We sat at the kitchen table, the low hum of the evening settling around us. Eric's hands trembled as he plugged the USB into my laptop. Folders popped up instantly. Videos, audio recordings, emails, meeting minutes with timestamps. The first video showed Judith in a dimly lit room, speaking in clipped tones to Rob Mendez and a few others. The camera angle was tight, almost like a surveillance clip. "Time's running out on the Winds," Judith said, voice cold. "Pressure them to comply or they leave. If they resist, escalate. We can't afford weak links." Another clip was Rob bragging about the gun incident. "I told them it was a warning shot," he laughed. "Should keep them quiet." There were emails where Judith discussed fast-tracking removals and financial incentives tied to vacant properties. I sat back, stunned. This wasn't just abuse, it was a conspiracy. Eric exhaled, rubbing his face. "I recorded some meetings myself. I couldn't speak up then, but I never wanted to be this deep in it." I nodded. "This changes everything." I played the audio of a meeting where board members debated strategies to encourage cooperation, a thinly veiled euphemism for intimidation. "Have you thought about what happens if they find out you're the source?" I asked. He looked at me like I'd asked if he wanted a bullet in the back. "I'm done hiding. If this goes public, I'm ready." The weight of his confession settled over the kitchen like the dusk outside. For the first time, I felt a crack in the armor Judith had built around Ashgrove Ridge. Later that night, I shared the files with Detective Miles, our FBI contact. His response was immediate and direct. "This is federal territory. Civil rights violations, illegal intimidation, potentially criminal conspiracy. We're bringing them down." But Miles warned me, "We need to be careful. Judith's got friends in high places. This fight's going to get dirty." I looked at Dad the next morning, sitting quietly on the porch bench, the sun catching the faded carvings on the wood. "We've got the evidence," I said. "Now we make them pay." Dad nodded slowly. "It's time to light the lamp." And so began the next chapter, moving from defense to offense, from reaction to strategy. The night after Eric handed me the USB, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, piecing together what to do next. We had the evidence, but evidence alone wasn't enough. If Judith suspected we were watching, she'd tighten her grip, maybe even retaliate. I needed a plan. The first thing I did was clear a corner of the garage. It was cluttered with old tools, paint cans, and decades of forgotten junk, but I claimed a small shelf and set up a discreet camera. Not some flashy security system, just a tiny lens hidden inside a smoke detector, positioned to catch the porch and driveway. If they wanted to keep playing dirty, I'd make sure every move was recorded. I also started leaking small, carefully crafted rumors, not to the HOA, but to Judith's inner circle, through casual conversations with neighbors and former acquaintances. I let slip that Dad might finally be looking to sell, that he was tired and ready to move on. I knew she'd hear the whisper, and if she was as greedy as her documents showed, she'd move fast. Alina helped too. She dug through the town archives and found old photos from community events, showing other houses with visible infractions, broken fences, unapproved sheds, even wildly overgrown lawns. But no violations were ever issued. The difference? Those homes belonged to Judith's allies. The inequity stung like a fresh wound. Armed with Elena's photos, Eric's recordings, and the new footage from the hidden camera, I started assembling a timeline, a visual story of selective enforcement, intimidation, and abuse of power. The garden light, fixed and glowing, became our beacon in the darkness, symbolizing the truth we were illuminating. One afternoon, while sitting on the porch, Dad caught me reviewing the footage on my laptop. "Looks like you've got eyes everywhere," he said, half smiling. "Only the ones we need," I replied. He nodded slowly. "Remember when you were a kid, you made that spy game with the walkie-talkies?" I laughed. "Yeah, didn't think I'd be using it for real." "Funny how things come full circle," he said. "This time, you're the one watching." Every night I recorded the comings and goings of the HOA's enforcers. The conversations caught on tape were more revealing than I expected. I heard Rob muttering about getting a warning for overstepping, but also boasting to Judith about the fear he'd planted. Judith herself could be heard discussing strategies to speed up compliance and identify weak spots. It was like watching a slow unraveling. But while I collected, I also made sure to stay in the open. I talked with neighbors who were too scared to speak but grateful someone was finally pushing back. Some nodded at me with cautious hope. Others refused to meet my gaze. I could feel the tension building, like the moment before a summer thunderstorm, only this storm was mine to unleash. And then there was the moment I knew we'd hit a nerve. A few nights after the cameras started, Rob showed up at the house after dark. Not with a badge this time, just a flashlight and a tight smile. He scanned the driveway, the porch, then gave a short laugh. "You really think those things are watching?" he said, pointing to the devices. I stepped out from the shadows. "They are," I said, "and so is everyone else. You want to play games? Fine, but I'm not the one who'll lose." He glared for a moment, then disappeared into the night. That exchange, small as it seemed, was a turning point. The threat was no longer one-sided. The foundation I'd been quietly building was strong enough to stand on. Next came the call to Detective Miles. We'd shared encrypted messages throughout the week, but now I knew it was time to move forward. "We've got what we need for a federal case," he said over the phone, "but this is going public soon. Be ready for fallout." I looked at Dad, sitting in his chair by the porch, his fingers tracing the faded carvings on the bench. "We're ready," I told him. He smiled, a genuine, rare smile. "We're finally ready." The first time I heard Rob brag about his immunity, I thought it was just noise, empty words from a man drunk on power. But then, on a chilly Saturday evening, it became chillingly real. I'd set the camera to record every movement around the porch and driveway, but I didn't expect the audacity that night. Rob showed up unannounced, pacing back and forth like a caged animal, muttering about wrapping this up. I watched the live feed on my phone from the basement, heart thumping. He pulled out his phone and dialed. "Yeah, I'm at Wynn's. Got the gate unlocked. Gonna pressure him again. Judith wants this done before the board meeting next week." I couldn't believe it. They were conspiring to break into Dad's property? As if on cue, Judith's car rolled down the street. Black SUV, tinted windows, imposing. Rob waved her over, and they exchanged whispered words just out of the camera's range. Then Rob tried the side gate, forcing it open with a grunt. The lock snapped with a metallic click that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet night. That's when I heard him, loud and unfiltered, caught by the hidden microphone in the nearby shed. "Force is the only language these old-timers understand," he boasted. "We'll have that ramp gone before they know it." Judith's laugh was cold, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "Good. Make it quick. The sooner they leave, the sooner we flip the place." I paused the recording, hands trembling. This wasn't just harassment anymore, this was trespassing and conspiracy. The next morning, I played the footage for Dad. His face was pale but steady. "They think they can scare us out. But this bench," he tapped the worn wood beside him, "isn't just wood, it's our history." I called Detective Miles immediately, sending the full footage and audio. "We've got 'em red hand," Miles said. "This kind of evidence is solid. Illegal entry, conspiracy, intimidation." But the fight wasn't over. 2 days later, Rob showed up at the neighborhood grocery, noticeably tense. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by quick glances and stiff shoulders. I ran into a neighbor in the aisle who whispered, "I saw Judith and Rob arguing outside the community center." She was furious about the camera footage. The irony wasn't lost on me. Judith, who prided herself on control, was unraveling. Alina sent me a message with photos from a recent board meeting. Judith, seated rigidly, eyes darting to an empty chair. Someone had resigned from the board in protest, and rumors were spreading fast. Then came the call from Miles. "We're ready to move in, but we need to coordinate. Any sudden moves could tip them off." I spent the next week preparing. I printed copies of the footage, timelines, and recorded testimony from neighbors who'd witnessed harassment but were too scared to speak before. Dad watched quietly as I organized the evidence, sometimes shaking his head in disbelief. "You've become quite the strategist," he said. "Had to," I replied. "Sometimes the only way to win is to outthink the bully." The bench on the porch became more than a symbol. It was my command center. I'd sit there late into the night, going over every detail, planning every move. One evening, as the wind rustled the leaves around the tree with my brother's initials, I realized this was bigger than us. This was about justice. And it was coming. The morning the FBI arrived, I felt a strange mixture of relief and tension, a bittersweet vindication in the air. Detective Miles called me early, voice sharp but measured. "We're bringing the team to the HOA headquarters today. Expect agents with warrants and a thorough sweep." I passed the news to Dad, who nodded quietly, adjusting the worn flag on the porch. That flag, the one we'd nearly lost, felt heavier somehow, like a silent witness ready to bear testament. We watched the black SUVs roll up to the community clubhouse, dark windows reflecting the sun like watchful eyes. The agents moved with purpose, papers in hand, badges flashing. Through the tinted glass, I saw Judith Langford step outside, her usual confident mask slipping for the briefest moment. She was flanked by Rob Mendez, who no longer carried himself with that swagger. Something had shifted, a crack in their armor. Within hours, agents were collecting boxes of files, computers, emails, everything that could tie them to the harassment campaign. I imagined the piles of documents we'd uncovered joining that mountain of evidence, each sheet a nail in their collective coffin. That afternoon, Miles called with updates. "Judith's trying to play victim, but the evidence is overwhelming. Rob was picked up off his cousin's property trying to lay low." Dad was watching the news, an old war documentary playing silently in the background. He looked at me and said, "This is what I fought for. Not just a country, but a chance to live with dignity." I saw that dignity flicker in his eyes, steady and proud despite everything. But even as the legal noose tightened, the HOA tried one last gambit. A community meeting was scheduled, ostensibly to discuss neighborhood improvements, but really to rally support and spin the story their way. Elena tipped me off. "They're desperate," she said over coffee. "Expect a show." I prepared my own folder, clean, concise, and filled with the undeniable truth. The videos, the emails, the testimonies, everything. When the night came, the hall was packed, faces I'd only seen in passing, neighbors, board members, the curious, and the cautious. Judith stood at the podium, rehearsed smiles masking a simmering tension. He opened with, "This has been a difficult time for Ash Grove Ridge, but we stand for community values and safety." Then it was my turn. I walked up quietly, placing the folder on the table. The room shifted. Uncertainty flickered. "I'm Marcus Wynn," I began, voice steady, "and this is my father's home." I laid out the evidence, one piece at a time, each document a story, each video a witness. Eric Dalton stood beside me when I finished, voice cracking as he spoke. "I was part of this board. I kept quiet too long, but I couldn't watch innocent families torn apart anymore. Judith used us, abused us, and betrayed our trust." A hush fell over the room. Judith's smile faltered, eyes darting. Miles stepped forward, reading the charges. "Federal violations of civil rights, intimidation, and conspiracy." "You heard the evidence," he said. "This is a matter of justice." From the back, a voice shouted, "Who's the real eyesore now?" Laughter rippled through the crowd, a release of tension, a reclaiming of power. Judith's retreat was quiet but decisive. Board members who'd stood by her slipped away, their loyalty as fragile as their reputation. Outside, Dad rested on the bench, the carved initials glowing softly in the night. He looked at me, smiled, and said, "We did it." I realized then, victory wasn't just about the law. It was about standing tall, even when the world tried to knock you down. The community hall buzzed with tension as I stepped onto the stage once more. The bench outside, where Dad sat quietly, seemed miles away now, but its carved initials echoed in my mind, a symbol of everything we were fighting for. Judith Langford stood rigid at the far end of the room, flanked by a handful of loyal board members who looked ready to bolt at any sign of trouble. The air was thick, anticipation sparking in every whispered conversation and sideways glance. I took a deep breath and began. My father's home isn't just a piece of property. It's a legacy carved by hands that built this neighborhood, by love, sacrifice, and years of community. I opened the folder before me, spreading out photos, videos, and copies of damning emails. The crowd leaned in. Faces I barely knew watched with rapt attention. "Here," I said, pointing to a grainy video clip, "is Judith Langford ordering her enforcer to intimidate and trespass. Here are documents revealing their plan to force my family out for a quick profit." A murmur rippled through the room. I glanced back at Judith. Her face was pale, her eyes darting like a trapped animal's. That's when Eric Dalton stepped forward, his voice breaking but clear. "I was part of this," he confessed, "and I kept silent too long. I was wrong. Watching families destroyed for profit wasn't justice. Judith abused her power. I want to make this right." His confession landed heavy in the silence. Some neighbors nodded, others wiped tears away. Judith's facade cracked, her lips pressed tight. Detective Miles stepped forward next, reading aloud the federal charges. Civil rights violations, conspiracy, intimidation. The words hung in the air like a verdict already delivered. From the back of the room, a voice rang out, sharp and biting. "Who's the real eyesore now?" Laughter erupted, sharp, triumphant, and strangely freeing. The tension that had gripped the room for months dissolved into a wave of relief and justice. Judith's supporters melted away, their silence louder than words. The board crumbled before our eyes. Outside, Dad sat on the bench, the night air cool against his face. I joined him, handing him a cup of coffee. He looked at me, eyes tired but shining. "We stood our ground." "We did more than that," I said softly. "We took back our home." The fight had been long, painful, and exhausting, but as the carved initials glowed faintly in the porch light, I knew this wasn't just an end. It was a beginning, a testament to resilience, truth, and the power of standing up for what's right. The days after the community meeting felt surreal, like waking up from a long nightmare. The oppressive weight Judith Langford had placed on us was finally lifting, but the scars were still fresh. Dad wheeled out onto the porch bench in the golden afternoon light. The carved initials, my brother's, etched deep into the wood, caught the sun's warmth. They weren't just marks in the grain anymore. They were a symbol of everything we'd fought to protect: family, home, and honor. I sat beside him, the weight of months of struggle finally settling into something softer. Relief, yes, but also quiet pride. The HOA board was dissolved, its members scattered like leaves before a storm. New elections were scheduled, promising transparency and respect instead of fear and control. Neighbors stopped by more often now, sharing smiles and stories that had been hushed for too long. Alina was working on a feature for the local paper, The House That Stood, a tribute to resilience and standing tall against injustice. One afternoon, as I fixed the garden light that once flickered with uncertainty, Dad spoke quietly. "You know, Marcus, this bench has seen more than just initials. It's witnessed promises, memories, and now, justice." I nodded. It's funny how something so simple can carry so much weight. He smiled, eyes glinting with a mix of nostalgia and hope. Maybe that's the real power of a home. Not the walls or the roof, but the stories it holds. We sat in silence for a moment, the breeze rustling through the leaves of the old oak tree nearby, the same tree that stood sentinel over years of laughter and tears. I looked at Dad and realized this victory wasn't just legal, it was deeply personal. It was about reclaiming dignity and setting things right, not with anger, but with quiet strength. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lawn, I felt a calm settle over us. I thought about the fight, the pain, and the unexpected allies. And I knew one thing for sure: justice isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's the soft echo of a carved bench, the steady glow of a repaired light, and the unbroken spirit of a family that refuses to be broken. "Thanks for standing with me," I said. Dad squeezed my hand gently. "Always." If you've ever faced an unfair fight with your HOA or battled to protect what matters most, I want to hear your story. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. Your voice matters, and together, we stand stronger. Remember, no matter how small your bench or how quiet your light, your story is powerful. Keep standing, keep fighting, and keep shining.